Hi, everyone. Doug DeVos here, and we're introducing the episode I did with John Dickson, who's just a fascinating guy, Australian guy, a lot of fun. Aussies are always fun, and very thoughtful historian who really takes his faith and makes it personal in a unique way through history. History is about people, and how he referred to his faith and how he referred to Christ and the Gospels. And especially the Gospels as a biography, and this is real. This is, Christ was a person, and then of course we wandered to a few other topics beyond that. He's a huge American football fan, which is really kind of unique for an Aussie, given how strong they are about their Aussie sports on a regular basis. But great guy, great conversation. I'm sure you're gonna love it.
We believe, and have always believed in this country, that man was created in the image of God. That he was given talents and responsibilities and was instructed to use them to make this world a better place in which to live. And you see, this is the really great thing of America.
It's time to discover what binds us together, and finding it has the power to transform our world. That's what I believe. How about you? John, thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for joining us here on Believe.
G'day, Doug. Thanks so much.
All right. Now, the first thing we're going to have to do is make sure we have the translation thing working between Australian English and American English, or maybe even more particular, Michigan English.
Yeah.
But I think we're doing pretty good here. There's a few times.
G'day?
I understand g'day and shrimps on the Barbie and a few other things like that. But welcome. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and we were just talking. You've kind of found your way to Grand Rapids on a somewhat regular basis in years past. Talk about what's brought you here, and then we'll talk a little bit more about who you are.
Well, I mean, the first time I came to Grand Rapids was because my publisher is based here.
Okay.
And they've been publishing my books for quite a while now, and so I came here for meetings with them.
Yeah.
And then they introduced me. One day I was at Zondervan head office here, and coming out of their recording studio was this guy called Jeff Mannion, who I'd never heard of.
Sure.
And my editor said, "Oh, you'd like this guy." And Jeff has since told me that he'd just done 4 hours of recording or something, and he just didn't want to meet another person. You know, sometimes you just think, I don't want to see anyone, I just want to get out of the building. Anyway, so he dutifully said, okay, I'll meet this Australian. And we hit it off.
Great.
And that was a Friday, and then I heard from someone else that he is a great public speaker. So I thought, I'm always up for a good public talk.
Right.
So I went to his Saturday night service.
Okay.
Turn up. He's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean,
does a great job at Ada Bible. He's really great.
the best communicators I have ever heard.
Yeah.
And we went out to dinner straight after his Saturday evening service.
Yeah.
I think we had a steak. You know, so 2 men over a steak.
That's got to be good,
in
right?
Michigan,
And nothing on the Barbie though. It wasn't shrimps on the Barbie. It was the old.
No,
it
but
was the Michigan way.
It was a serious Michigan steak.
Oh, okay.
And we became mates. And he invited me to then preach at his church, and I've been speaking there, you know, for 10, 12 years or something.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, you have a great Grand Rapids connection that happens here, which is fun to talk about. And we were talking earlier. You also have an American football connection. You got to talk a little bit about how that happened, because as an Aussie, and I remember traveling many years ago when I was young in Australia, when it was a big deal that they were going to broadcast the Super Bowl. You know, of course, it's middle of the night and all that sort of stuff, but they were going to broadcast the Super Bowl, and I remember seeing advertisements for it. But you've kind of started to enjoy American football.
Yeah, but I'd never watched a game, not even on the television,
Right.
before 2011, when I got an email inviting me to talk to this team called the Green Bay Packers.
That's right.
And I had honestly never heard of them. I mean, maybe someone had said
Why
the
would
word,
you, right? I mean,
well,
why?
but I had heard of the Dallas Cowboys.
Sure, okay. Yeah.
I don't know why.
Yeah.
But I guess it's like if you know any team, you know, if you think British football,
Yeah.
everyone's heard of Liverpool or Manchester United.
Right.
But they might not have heard of Leicester City.
That's right.
So anyway, I had to ask my son if this team's any good that wants me to come and talk to them. And he was delightful. He said, "Oh yes, they're very good," and they just won the Super Bowl because it was 2011.
Yeah,
and can I come?
That's right.
Right. So a couple of months later, sure enough, I bring my son. I come here, And
You were still in Australia at the time?
Yeah, living in Australia.
Okay, so you
Yeah,
came
I'd
all the
only-
way from
I'd
Australia
only lived
to...
in America for 7 months.
Okay.
So so this is 2011. I came because I was doing lots of speaking and stuff around my books anyway.
Okay.
I mean, I've been coming to the US twice a year for
Yeah.
10, 15 years.
Yeah, okay.
So I came and went out and spoke to the team. Didn't know a single human in the team.
Yeah.
So I was not nervous talking
Right,
to them.
right.
Because
Just a bunch of-
they're just a bunch of oversized men.
Yeah, that's right.
You know? And it was delightful because in the hotel room where they were all setting up in like the seminar room, when I got there was no team there, and they'd placed the chairs with a full chair distance between them. And I
Right.
thought, that's weird. Do they like sitting way apart? Until the team comes in, you realise.
They filled the space. Yeah, they filled the space, didn't they? Yeah.
So anyway, I talked to them, and Mike McCarthy was the coach in those
Right.
days, and he had read this book I'd written on humility,
Right.
and how where humility came from as a virtue, how it's influenced the Western world, and how modern leadership literature interacts with humility.
Right.
So I spoke on that theme, and then he invited me to come back the next week, and I spoke to the team in Detroit. So here in Michigan.
I know. We'll talk about the Lions and the Packers, and maybe after we're done with this
Well,
section
of
a
course,
little bit
now
more.
I live in Chicago, right?
Okay, yeah.
And
Oh.
I keep quiet about liking the Packers
Yeah.
because I have come to actually love them.
Yeah.
I've now seen, I don't know how many games, probably 15 or 20 games, and live, so it's quite an experience. And nothing prepares you for American football.
Yeah.
I thought Aussies were sports mad.
Yeah.
And they kind of are,
Right.
but in football season, you guys
Crazy.
are nuts.
Yeah, that's right.
Honestly, it's just amazing. And going to a game, like the energy of a game and the singing and the shouting, and then there's no gaps. Like as soon as there is a gap, there's an amazing commercial with people dancing and backflipping. and just when you've got this sensory overload, they fly jets. Right? So it's quite an experience for an Australian.
Oh, that's fantastic. So I'll just say one thing: Lions Packers, December 15, 1991. Mm-hmm. Barry Sanders is playing. You may not know Barry Sanders, great running back, one of the greatest players from the Lions forever. It's also the day of the birth of our son. So we're in the hospital, and I am the worst dad ever, and there's a lot of things that Maria, my wife, could tell you about other stories, but I'm watching the game, and we win. It's against Green Bay. We win. And I'm like, this is going to be a great day. We're going to have our first child. We're going to, the Lions won. This is going to be a beautiful thing. And I think it was at least 25 years until the Lions won again in Green Bay or something like that. And I think they've only done it once or twice since, so.
You didn't call your child Lion or something?
No. I stayed away from that. But it's good fun. It's just such a great rivalries. That's what sport is. It brings out those sorts of things. Yeah. But that's not what we're here to talk about. It's fun to talk about. But what it does talk about things we're passionate about. Things that engage us and drive us forward. But one of the things that we talk about a lot, on Believe on the podcast is kind of deeper. We want to dive a little deeper, and maybe we'll just kind of frame it and start the discussion a little deeper with you as an advocate of Christianity and author and speaker. Talk about how we should think about Christianity and the good news of it and the impact of it, not only from a faith perspective, but in a cultural perspective as well. We'll give you a little runway, and in that maybe take a little time of how you found your way from youth. What are the experiences that brought you to the journey that you're on today and the belief system that's important to you. So I'll give you a little runway to kind of turn around here and go after it.
Well, I was raised in your classic Australian Sydney household.
Okay.
With no religion. Zero.
Right.
I really didn't even know Christians.
Right.
Because Australia's, it has been described as the first genuinely post-Christian society. That is a society that was sort of created itself in a conscious turning away from Christianity. So I hadn't been into a church before I was 16.
Wow.
But I did have a teacher at my school, just a state school,
Okay.
but a volunteer teacher who was incredibly smart and funny and open about the faith.
Yeah.
And it was through her speaking sort of generously about Christianity that I thought there might be something in it. And I started
what
reading.
piqued your interest? I mean, most 16-year-old kids
Yeah.
don't get.
Yeah, and I was into
That-
music and Manchester United. That was
Okay.
my life.
Okay, all right.
and Nina Harding. Hello, Nina, if you're watching. I think, this woman was an astonishing example of a very worldly but committed Christian.
Yeah.
So her husband, Kevin Weldon, was Australia's biggest publisher. I didn't know any of that at this time.
Okay.
But she moved in these sort of very interesting circles. They had Pele to dinner one night. They had
wow.
Maradona because they published books about them. So she moved in these circles, but she was a volunteer teacher at my school as well. And I was just intrigued by this woman who was so part of the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And very successful and part of a very successful family, but who would volunteer at my school and was really devout and not creepy in her Christian commitment, right? She was just open and funny and, I would throw my smart aleck questions at her. Is that an expression you use, smart aleck?
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that translates.
All right, so I'd throw these questions, and instead of her getting angry or defensive, she would just say, "Well, John, have you thought of this?"
Yeah.
And I found myself really intrigued.
Yeah.
And I think, as I reflect back, I was interested in deep things, even though my main things were the rock band U2 and Manchester United.
And you, I'll divert just a second. You started down a career as a singer-songwriter in a band yourself, right?
Mm-hmm, I did.
Okay.
And in a way that came out of my discovery of the Christian faith.
Okay.
But I had also lost my dad in a plane crash some years earlier. It was a big commercial air disaster. And I think that had always made me, I don't know what the right word is, like a thoughtful kid.
Yeah.
Like I was a bit of a tearaway.
Yeah.
I was the class clown. I was the classic kid whose report always said could do well if he applied himself at all.
Yeah,
I was that kid. But that thoughtfulness, having had such a terrible event in my life, I reckon gave me a sense that there's got to be more to life.
Yeah.
And so that's why I was tuned into what this woman was saying.
Got it.
And I started reading the Gospels. These are the biographies of Jesus.
Right. And you just started on your own. Did she encourage it? Somebody? Okay.
She encouraged it. In fact, she ended up running these sessions at her home, which would be illegal now. But Friday afternoons after school, for anyone who was interested. But she would make hamburgers, milkshakes, and scones. Those British scones.
Oh yeah. Food and
cream and
food
jam.
and
Oh yeah,
is a key element of
So
Christianity, isn't it?
My mates and I turn up to her home. It's beautiful, Mossman mansion, blah, blah, blah. And she feeds us enormous amounts of food. And I remember thinking, sitting there in a beautiful couch, having eaten, I don't know how many hamburgers, thinking, I couldn't get up out of this couch if I tried, Like maybe she's some wicked witch and she's about to cast a spell.
Yeah.
But instead she said, have you got questions about the Christian things I've been talking about? Oh, well, we had millions of questions. And we kept on going back Friday after Friday. And her policy was, these kids know nothing, so let's go with the main thing. And she read to us the Gospels. And I kept on going to these sessions from end of year 9 to the end of year 12, so 2.5 years. And it was, for me, the journey to Christianity was via just understanding the life of Jesus Christ. His teachings, his healings, his death, the resurrection. Like, I ended up thinking, this is magnificent. And it is one of the things I still will talk about. In fact, the recent series I'm doing here in Grand Rapids at Ada is how Christianity, weirdly, is a biographical religion, in as much as it's about a person.
Okay.
And people don't stop. If you're raised in the sort of Christian West, you think every religious tradition, every sacred scripture would have biographies. No, none does.
Yeah.
Christianity's, the first 4 texts of the New Testament are biographies.
Right.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. We call them Gospels, good news, but they're biographies. And that tells you something about the unusual nature of the Christian faith. It isn't inviting you into a ritual,
Right.
or a series of regulations, or a world takeover program, or anything. It's inviting you to get to know a human who, as you get to know the human, turns out to be a lot more than the human.
Right.
His teachings and his healings and his death, and I'm one of those people who actually believes in the resurrection too.
Yeah.
As an historical event. That biographical nature of Christianity is still, to me, utterly compelling. It was my way into Christianity as a 16-year-old.
Yeah.
And now it's still utterly compelling.
Yeah.
Because the more I look at it, and I do it now as someone who's a professional historian,
Right.
it's solid.
Yeah.
It's biographical, but it's historical biography. Like the data we have from the first century to locate this figure of Jesus as a genuine first century Galilean Jew is overwhelming.
Yeah.
And so I am drawn...
Overwhelming me. It's just collaborated in many different ways, in many different styles.
The sources we have from the Christians are very early and haven't been copied from one another. Then we have non-Christian references from the first century that mention Jesus and mention in broad outline what he did. The archaeological record just confirms what we see in the Gospels. So whichever angle you come at it from, it looks like it really happened.
Yeah.
I mean, I wear, I'm hiding it at the moment, but I wear underneath my shirt a Roman denarius.
Okay.
This is an actual 2,000-year-old denarius.
Wow.
Which I got this one in Jerusalem. This is Emperor Tiberius on the front,
Okay.
and his mum Livia on the back. And the reason I wear it is it's a reminder that history is solid.
It's real.
It's real. Yeah. So this was actually in the hands of humans in the time of Jesus, because it's actually exactly dated to the time of Jesus.
Wow.
And it reminds me that when we're talking about the events of Jesus, we're not talking about, some fairy tale or The Hobbit, in Middle Earth.
That's right.
This is real history.
Yeah.
It's as solid as this piece of silver still is in my fingers today. That's what I find utterly compelling.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much more I could say, because
Well,
Christianity then spread throughout the Roman world
and
gave us what we now call the Western world.
Yeah. Well, we'll go to that in a second, but and we'll get there. Talk about, you said it's a biography. It's history. It really happened, and it's about a person. It's a relationship without rituals and regulations. But over the years, there's been a lot of rituals and regulations that have grown up. I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church here, and in virtually every other church and of all faiths, there's a lot of that element. How do we distinguish or not let the rituals and regulations get in the way of the relationship? How do you navigate that, and how could we think about that?
It's deeply human to want to do something. To be an active partner in this, and therefore give me a ritual, because then I know if I've done these 4 things, I can tick the box, right?
The works.
But it's so human. Like we want to know that we've participated, we've contributed, and Christianity does mess with your head because it says, you can't.
That's right.
Go try.
But a lot of people
fail.
say you can and you should, and if you don't do this or that.
Well, in every religion does say that.
Yeah.
But actually, if you read your Gospels, Jesus isn't saying that.
Right.
There's so little ritual in those 4 biographies. So little about doing anything, except knowing how much you are loved by the Almighty, and letting that trigger in you an overflow of love toward the world. And that isn't a ritual. Like that's a life adventure. Being animated by God's love to love the world. That's what you find in the Gospels. And I think, to answer your question directly, the way to not give in to that temptation always to find a ritual, something I can do, something my contribution, is just to keep reading the Gospels. Read those biographies, go back to the man, because in the end, Christianity is as simple as knowing that life of Jesus, his teaching, healings, death, resurrection, and trusting him
Yeah.
with your life.
Yeah.
It's really simple.
Yeah.
And some rituals are good. I mean, because they foster that, they can encourage that, but it's got to be that way around. The genuine trust needs to foster the ritual rather than think of the ritual as a thing you have to do to eventually get into the divine book.
Right. And that gets confused a lot, and upside down. So now I'll let you get back to, okay, so you said it a little bit in passing, but you believe in the resurrection.
I do.
Right? And so talk about, because when you tell the story of Christ, isn't it easy for us to say, well, I like that part of the story, and I like this part of the story, and I like this teaching over here, and I like, but that's not the whole story.
No.
And so so talk about, from a historical perspective, how the whole story is connected, and then we can get back to the impact it's had since.
Yeah. Well, the resurrection isn't just like the punchline at the end.
Right.
When you read those Gospels, you can already tell that the Gospels have only been written because they know this one that you're reading about died and rose again.
Yeah.
Like it's embedded. It's not just like the appendix.
Right. It's central to the story.
Yeah. So when you read the story,
it is the story.
It's telling you, like, without the resurrection, none of this matters. Yeah. That's really how the Gospel writers themselves tell the story.
Right. It's interesting that there's very little written about his birth as there is about...
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Mark's account of Jesus and John's account of Jesus don't say anything about the birth. Yeah. So, Christmas is a much lower priority than Easter. But even if you step back and think of it like a secular historian, so that is my academic background.
Okay.
So I did a PhD in ancient history in a secular university. And what they do is they work out how many different sources, ancient sources, say roughly the same thing about a person.
Right.
And from those sources, you can work out what is reasonable and what isn't.
Right.
Especially if the sources are very early, as in within living memory of the events, not hundreds of years later.
Right.
And on all of those criteria, the New Testament and the other sources that we have all point in one direction. What most secular historians who write on this topic will agree on are two things. There was an empty tomb that needed an explanation, and plenty of people were running around saying, I've seen him.
Right.
So they're the things we can prove as history. Now you might say, okay, sure, but we don't know what explains those two things. And a lot of historians do say exactly that. Yeah. I don't know what explains it. Yeah. There's a famous historian from Duke University, Ed Sanders, and he says that Jesus' followers and Paul had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. What explains the experiences? I do not know.
Interesting.
So he's saying they definitely had an experience that they were sure was Jesus alive again. Right. But I don't know what that is. That's above my pay grade as a historian, is what he's saying. And lots of historians say that. Yeah. But they agree there was an empty tomb. And these key eyewitnesses really thought they saw him. And what makes that so compelling is we have very good evidence, a number of them, at least 4, but probably more, died for their claim to have seen Jesus alive again. Right. And these are the ones who knew if it were made up or not. It's not like if you or I die for something we believe in, it just tells you we were sincere. Right. But these were the ones who knew if it were made up.
Right. Yeah. They would have known that they made the story up and that it wasn't true.
So who dies for something they know they didn't really see?
Yeah.
Because people forget in the modern world, the early Christians, at least for the first 3 centuries, it didn't come with a Vatican and treasures and calling the shots in government. Yeah. People confuse that. They think of how powerful Christianity is today. And they go, oh, they were trying to trick us from the beginning, to have power. No, power was the last thing on their agenda because they had none.
They had none.
And in fact, they lost property, liberty, and a bunch of them, the key eyewitnesses, lost their lives. Right. All of that is exactly the kind of evidence a resurrection would leave behind.
Wow. So so you have a group of people who believe something incredibly powerful in their lives, and those who were closest to it would have known in their mind if it was made up or it was not. But it goes on, and you talk about the first 300 years and beyond there. Talk about you mentioned earlier, it kind of created the West that we know. So talk about that, and why do we say, why was the direction that way? What about the East? So help us understand a little bit of then the impact of it and what those belief systems turned into, and what maybe what we think about today that's accurate, that connects them, or to your point, what we kind of blame them for.
Yeah.
Help us think through that a little bit and understand that.
Well, the fact is that what we call the Western world, which is a controversial expression, if you think of it only as like, white people. Right?
Yeah.
But that's not the way to think of it. The Western world, historically speaking, is the world that is literally west of Greece.
Okay.
Right? All the way to the UK. And was influenced by three factors. Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Judeo-Christian beliefs.
Okay.
Those three streams, if you like, create the river we call the West.
Okay.
And because Christianity spread west, it went, from Greece into Italy, and from Italy into France, and France it went up into Saxony, and then way up into Scandinavia. I've just finished writing about how the Vikings became Christians.
But it also went into Africa too, didn't it?
And very early on,
it
went into Africa. But the African story is a little bit. It went east, and it went south down into Africa. But with the emergence of Islam 500-600 years after Christianity, that Christianity almost disappeared.
Okay.
So North Africa was entirely Christian in the 5th century.
Okay.
It was entirely Muslim by the 7th century.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that didn't happen in Europe. The Western Christian, Greek and Roman and Christian tradition reshaped Europe.
Okay.
And then that European culture, that melting pot of Roman politics, Greek philosophy, and the Judeo-Christian religion was crystallized in Europe, and that's what gave America its culture.
Yeah.
Because really, American culture was just British culture transplanted here. Same with Aussie culture.
Yeah.
And there are things that we know the Greeks and Romans didn't have, but we have in the Western world, that can only have come from Christianity.
Okay.
And they are things like the value of humility. When you meet a great person who is humble, we love it, don't we?
Yeah. Right.
In
That's what you
ancient
spoke
Rome-
about to the Packers.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Why do we love it? Because in ancient Rome and Greece, humility was not a virtue. That word actually meant crushed. Humility was a negative word, to be pushed down low. But what seems to have happened, and there's a lot of research on this, is because of the Christ story, the greatest Lord gave himself for others, that upended what it meant to be great. So the ethic of humility is given to us by Christianity. Another very practical example is hospitals and medical care. This was not available to the public in Greece and Rome. But the early Christians almost instantly started hospitals. And it became very quickly the responsibility of every bishop in Europe. We're talking like in the first few hundred years. To have a hospital. So that by, say, 600 AD, there were literally thousands of hospitals. And they were free to the poor.
Wow.
So that tradition of medical centres being available to everyone comes from Christianity. And the other is education. Yes, it's true that Greeks and Romans had a good education system for the elites. But the Christians turned their, what we might call Sunday school or catechism, into little schools where you would also learn grammar and literature and astronomy and music, as well as Bible and so on. So that by the 8th century, the church is establishing schools in almost every geographical region, open to the elites and the poor, to boys and to girls. And this became the norm. And now we assume there should be a school in every community.
Right.
No one in the ancient Greek or Roman world
Ever
thought
thought
that was even needed.
Yeah.
We now assume it, but it's only because of the impact of the Christians trying to get education to everyone.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're just a few examples of what we mean when we say the Western world owes so much of what it loves to the influence of Christianity in that Western stream, everything west of Greece.
Yeah. So talk a bit. So a couple things, and I'll keep trying to remember them because I love this. You talked about the conflict of it going south in Africa and the conflict or the competition, if you will, maybe from Islam. What about it going further east? Was it similar with other religions there that kind of were competing, if you will, and what's then the impact? You know, what do we see that we can trace back to maybe the beginnings of those religions?
Well, they're kind of
systems.
hermetically sealed. So Hinduism and Buddhism never got to the West. So as much as, you know, I've got a lot of time for Hinduism and Buddhism, I used to teach both those religions, the history of those religions at Macquarie University in Australia. So I've got great affection for them as traditions, but they never influenced the Western tradition. They were sort of sealed over in their region, partly because they were not a missionary faith in the way that Christianity was from the beginning, trying to find new people who hadn't heard what they thought was terrific news.
That's where we started with the good news, the Gospels.
But Christianity did go to the East and was the dominant religion in, say, 500 in what we might call the sort of the Middle East. So in Arabia, Christianity was very prominent, right up into Syria. But with the rise of Islam, around 600, let's call it 600, and with the terrific success of the first Islamic government, which was based in Medina in Saudi Arabia in 622, and then very shortly after they had another Islamic government in Mecca, and they were able to expand their government because Islam, sort of unlike Christianity, is deliberately and openly and happily a legislative system as well as a religion. That they don't
separation
they don't
of church and
those
state.
things.
No church. Yeah.
And they became incredibly successful.
Yeah.
And Islam had armies, unlike Christianity, from the very beginning. And those armies were terrifically successful. Now, I don't want to walk down the track of saying, you know, Islam is a religion of violence, because I don't think of it like that. I think of Islam more like the Roman Empire.
Okay.
Islam sort of saw itself as giving great things to the world, and our armies go ahead of us and bring those great things to the world. But one consequence of that is Christianity was pushed back out of Saudi Arabia, out of Syria, eventually out of Turkey.
Right.
Turkey, what we call Turkey, was the Byzantine Empire. Probably the best kept secret in all of history was there was a 1,000-year Christian empire in Turkey. But it shriveled right back to just Constantinople, and then in the 15th century, even Constantinople was lost to the expansion of Islamic culture. But in Africa, Islam swept through, very shortly after Muhammad's life, swept through all of Syria, down through Israel, which had been Christian, and all of Egypt, which Egypt was the intellectual center of Christianity in this period. But that was all just swept away over into Carthage, so North Africa, right across Morocco. We think of that as an Islamic country, but it was entirely Christian in this period. Right over to Spain. And so from that point, Christianity became fixed as a Western phenomenon, even though prior to that point it had been West and East.
Right.
And that's why it is actually quite historically reasonable to speak of the Western world, because it's a real, genuine history that had a geography.
Right. Fascinating. I love hearing that, because it's so easy to just accept things today because that's the way it was. But if you don't know the story of history and you don't know why that happened, and you see things and it manifests itself in architecture and arts and science and all these other elements, and that's where I want to go next, because your work talks of, is very founded in Christianity and your beliefs, but it's also very historical and connected into culture. And so you have the your podcast, which is
Undeception.
Undeception. Okay,
The opposite of a deception.
Yeah, that's right, Undeception. And you break down in there certain areas that you talk about and the impact of Christianity in these areas. And you're also the Center for Public Christianity, of talking about the Christian faith and seeing how it connects into culture. And so maybe we can kind of dive into that. And I know on your podcast you talk about, you had the 4 areas. You got philosophy, you got arts, you got science, and
history.
History, thank you, which we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Talk about those.
Wow.
And how do you get into some of those areas? And some of, science. A lot of folks may today say, well, religion and science don't mix, and that they've traditionally fought against each other.
Yeah.
Is that the case?
They've traditionally not fought against each other. They have traditionally supported each other to an incredible degree. But there is a kind of modern myth.
Yeah.
And
so
that was
undeceive us.
Started in the 19th century to sort of talk about a perennial dispute between Christianity and science. And it's because there were growing disputes in the 19th century between Christianity and science, particularly around evolutionary theory. That was problematic. And then the story of Galileo, the church disagreeing with Galileo, which was largely political, not theological. But that story of the Galileo incident, which the church did dumb things, absolutely. That story has been told as like the parable of what always happens.
Yeah.
But actually, the historians of science today, even the very secular ones, they think that's not really a very good parable. Apart from anything else, many bishops supported Galileo. And many people who already had Galileo's broad beliefs were accepted by the church.
Okay.
So there was a political problem between Galileo and the church, which is highly complex, but has been well studied. The science that we call natural science really is a function of the 16th and 17th centuries. And all of the founders of the sort of the new science were Christians and thought that they were discovering more about God's mind.
Yeah.
And I have a friend, her name is Sarah Irving Stonebreaker, who was
a great name.
an atheist and top student in New South Wales in Australia, and got a scholarship to go to Cambridge and then to Oxford and then to Florida State University. But she went as an atheist, and she ended up doing her doctoral studies as an atheist in the origins of Western science, this sort of 16th, very important 16th century. And it disturbed her as she read the original documents of these scientists, right? Which are all stored at Cambridge, because it's like people like Isaac Newton, right? And Johannes Kepler and so on. They're all talking about God in their scientific treatises. They're all talking about how the more they know about the planets, the more they're seeing the genius of God in creation. The more they understand gravitation, they're seeing the power and mathematics of the divine mind. And it disturbed her. And she was really quite taken by this. So she started to do some reading about Christianity. What was Christianity in those days, in that 16th, 17th century? She ended up completely changing her mind, having always thought there was a contradiction between science and religion, to actually thinking, no, Christianity gave us science, because they went out looking at the world as an ordered place where you will find mathematical beauty. Yeah. And that inspired them because they believed in a mind behind nature. They went looking for that mind in nature. She, to cut a long story short, Sarah, then went to Oxford and went to a series of lectures by a famous atheist, Peter Singer, who's now at Princeton. arguing why atheism makes sense. And she went to those lectures and she came away going, atheism doesn't make sense. And then she went to Florida State University, met with Christians there, and she is now a very important academic in the history of science in Australia and a very devout Christian.
Wow.
She really gave her life to Christ. But it required her seeing through the modern parables we tell ourselves, like science and Christianity are in conflict.
Yeah. But interesting, in fact, when you talk about the scientists studying God, but she became a follower of the person, Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
How does that? There's one. You would think just kind of the bigger ideas of is there a God, is there not a God, that sort of thing, and she came to through this study, but she went deeper, and further, and maybe without diving into exactly her story, although you may want to touch on that a little bit. You also wrote a number of books about the doubter's perspective and on all sorts of pieces. Can you maybe help us connect those sorts of things a little bit? Because all of us have doubt. We were joking earlier, you must be a great fan of Thomas, right? Doubting Thomas, because that was a lot of your books. And so how do you, and as we talk about here often, it's a belief set. What do you believe? How do you come to that? Because we all have doubts. We all have questions. What's that process look like, and what sort of energy does it take to form a belief system, and how does someone, and it just hit me as she went through that process. That's a lot of work. I mean, she's really smart. She's done a lot of things. I don't know if everybody's going to do that. Like,
I feel
like
intimidated
that.
in her presence.
Exactly. So, but how do we do that?
Well, I mean, there's a double-barreled question there. I mean, moving from God to Jesus is both quite a transformation, but actually it's also a logical one. Because if you come to think as Sarah did, there's probably a mind behind the universe. Right. The next question is there any evidence on the world stage that mind has touched the earth in a tangible way? Yeah. Is there an X marks the spot? And she came to think Jesus' life is the X marks the spot. Yeah. That is God entering into history in a tangible way, not in someone's vision, not in a distant scriptural text, but in actual history. Right. And so that's how she came from God to Jesus. But the question of doubt, I think, is a great one. And yes, I have.
You've written a lot about that.
Yeah. I think in one of my books I said something like, if I'm a world-class anything, it's a world-class doubter.
Right.
Because there's nothing I believe
which is
now.
Great. You got a question.
Yeah. There's nothing I believe right now that I haven't seriously doubted and chucked in. Yeah. But you've got to sort of break down doubt, because doubt is not all of the same kind of thing. So there are doubts that are just intellectual doubts. You might read a book or have a conversation with a smart person who gives you 3 reasons why you shouldn't believe the Bible or whatever. Yeah. Well, that's just an intellectual doubt. Yeah. And I think just go and study it. Yeah. Just go and get to the bottom of it. Because I'm really confident there's no question you could ask of the Christian faith that hasn't been answered by some nerd in some book in some library somewhere. Right. So go and study.
They've all been asked.
Exactly.
Maybe there's new ones.
It's been around a long time and it's still here smiling sweetly back at you. But there are other kinds of doubts. There's what you might call psychological doubt, which is the doubt that emerges when something's too good to be true, or so much hangs on it, your mind says, are you sure? Yeah. It's like the cold feet people get before their wedding day. Yeah. Is that a cold feet? Is that an expression?
Yes, exactly. Okay. You've been around the U.S. a lot.
Yeah,
you got them all figured out.
On a daily basis.
Yeah, I know. I lived in England for a while. I got into trouble a few times too.
See, what's happening with cold feet, it isn't that there's no rational reason to get married. It's that so much hangs on this. Mm-hmm. Your mind says, it's a little protective mechanism. Are you sure? Yeah. And that happens when people approach Christianity. It begins to look robust. It looks beautiful. It might be true. And your mind goes, but hang on, are you sure? Because imagine if you make a terrible mistake here. Yeah. So there's psychological doubt. Yeah. And it's very different from intellectual. And the third kind of doubt is moral doubt. And that's when Christianity says something I don't like. Huh. It has some ethical command that I disagree with. So the whole thing must be false. Instead of doubting myself, I doubt Christianity.
Yeah.
And so that it's a moral doubt. It's, what Christianity says about money. I don't like that.
Yeah.
So I doubt Christianity. Yeah. It's a way of just sort of coping with that dissonance between Christianity and my mind. Or Christianity says something about sex I don't want to live that way.
Right.
So I doubt Christianity. Right. Instead of stopping and thinking, maybe I'm wrong and it's right. Okay, so doubt is really interesting. And so I've thought a lot about doubt and assessing my own doubts and talking to a lot of doubters over the years. I have a great sympathy for them. Yeah. That's why so many of my books are actually for doubters, not for the great strong Christians out there.
Yeah.
Because I think most people who doubt, they're not idiots. They've got reasons.
Yeah.
And it might be, if I were to offer a fourth category of doubt, some people have been harmed by Christians, doing terrible things, and they just they find it hard to think there's anything beautiful in it.
This hypocritical experience that they've had.
Yeah. I set an assignment for my students at Wheaton College, and I've just last week marked this particular assignment. I got them to go and interview someone they know and get on well with who doesn't believe in Christianity, and ask them what they think of Christians, what they think of Jesus Christ, and what are their reasons for not being a Christian. And the reports back, almost all of them had positive things to say about Jesus, and really negative things to say about the church.
Yeah.
I thought, how tragic.
Yeah.
That the church has a growing reputation that is not entirely deserved, but it is partly deserved.
Yeah.
And it keeps people from seeing the beautiful thing that really is at the heart of church.
Yeah. Our church had a slogan when it started, the church for people who don't like church,
Cool.
and it was
Sign me up.
It was launched it just for that way to say, all the rituals, all the stuff that you might associate with it, we're going to do away with. So grab a cup of coffee, have some popcorn, come on in, and we're not going to ask you for money right away. We're not going to, we're just going to try to live up to a different standard. We're all human. We all fail. Right? And that impacts, tragic in someone's life when they've been harmed by somebody they wanted to trust. And that I like the way you articulate. That's a real. That's a real deal, and it's a huge impact. We went down science a little bit. Let me go back and ask you to go down arts a little bit. You mentioned earlier, singer, songwriter, into music, same sort of element. Talk about how God and Christ is reflected in our work, in all of our work, but especially in an artistic expression. Talk about that. I'm really fascinated because, again, you have kind of two sides, right? Where there's a tremendous, art and music and that's very aligned, and then a tremendous element where it isn't really aligned.
Yeah. Well, from the very beginning, the Christians worked out that the genius of God, if I can put it like that, or God's wisdom, is imprinted in the world. It's why there's regularity in the in the stars. It's why mathematics works. And they also worked out it doesn't just relate to philosophy and mathematics and astronomy. It relates to the arts. Why does music work? And music does work. There are some notes you can't put in a line together because it will sound bad to everyone. And then there are notes that you can put in a line, and then we all go, everyone will go, great. That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Or chords. The chords are sort of multiple notes together that create a pleasing sound. But you can add one or two more notes that aren't meant to be in that particular chord, and it sounds horrible to everyone's ear, jarring. So what's going on there? And from the beginning, the church wrote all these philosophical treatises about music and the arts, because they thought when you come across something beautiful, whether it's a melody or a painting, you're actually seeing the genius of God. Why does the world work like that? Why does this melody cause me sadness and this melody causes me joy? Now, of course, there is a scientific explanation. It goes into my ears and it causes the synapses, but there's got to be more going on than that.
Yeah.
And the church, therefore, valued the arts not as like ways to, trick people into church.
Right.
Let's have a beautiful painting,
Yeah.
and maybe they'll come and see.
Yeah.
Or let's have great music.
Then we close the door behind them.
Yeah. They actually thought that they were discovering the genius of God in things, and displaying that genius of God. So they wrote beautiful tunes, and they got artists to paint beautiful things, where things like proportionality and shade and aspect were important conveyors of this genius of God. And so in a sense, not only is academic work an act of worship in the history of the church, so is artistic work an act of worship. Now, I must say, because of that, it's very easy to reject God in that and produce music and art that is a big no to beauty.
Right.
And I won't name names, but I'm sure people have come
Everybody
across artworks
everybody can imagine on their own
that are actually deliberately negation. They are trying to negate the great tradition of beauty that has been at the core of art through all of human history. But in the modern world, as we become more suspicious of theology, of higher, like metaphysics and higher narratives, we're very suspicious of that. Part of our protest is to produce art, and we can discuss whether it is art. I'm not going to sit there, but to produce art that says no to all of it.
Wow.
And it's powerful, it's visceral, and causes a protest from more traditionalists.
Right.
Precisely because art is at its best an indication of the genius of God built into everything.
Yeah.
It's possible to make it disgusting by negating it. In the same way that I can make a beautiful C chord sound terrible by adding two other notes that just will make everyone go, oh. You can protest against the beauty.
Yeah.
And I think much of our world is just doing that on every level, protesting against the beauty.
Yeah. Fascinating. I love music. I'm not musically inclined. My parents gave me a set of drums when I was young. I had a couple buddies who played the drums. I thought that'd be pretty cool. And I don't think anyone's ever said there was anything good that came from me playing the drum. It's one of those chords that you could anyway. It just doesn't work that well for me. I think I'm doing okay, but it's not passing the test. Let's talk about. Let's bring it home to today. The studies, as you said, in the United States, are saying that those, I'm trying to remember the right phrasing, but 78% in about 10 years ago or so would saying the Christians, and about that's now down to 63 now, and so you're seeing trends where people at huge levels and scale are rejecting the faith, or at least not joining the faith, or expressing their alignment with it. And how does that, when we talk about all this history, 2,000 years since the time of Christ, and all the things that define the Western world, how do we think about what we're experiencing today? We live in a country, I'm sure there's similar things in Australia where there's conflict, whether it's political or whether it's philosophical or whatever it is, it's division.
Yeah.
And so how do we think about, this division that we have? And you raised something earlier that I wanted to call out again. Just a simple phrase, well, I could be wrong, but a lot of people are absolutely sure they're right. And we live in Grand Rapids. President Jerry Ford always said, we can disagree without being disagreeable. But it seems like we're disagreeing and being disagreeable in our culture much more. And it hurts.
Yeah. There are multiple things going on all at once, it seems, in the Western world.
Right.
And part of it is this protest against what was there before.
Yeah.
It is the no to beauty.
Yeah.
I think explains a lot of things, including the great no that you're hearing about religion.
Yeah.
Australia has similar numbers. So your numbers now of 63% of Americans saying that they're willing to be aligned as some kind of Christian.
Right.
I mean, obviously 63% aren't Christians,
Right.
but they're still willing to say. But that was us about 12 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We're now 44%
Okay. In Australia.
in Australia. And on the American trajectory, it's from 78 10 years ago to 63 now, you're going to be a minority.
Right.
Christianity is going to be a minority in this country. And if it's anything like what happened in Australia when that tipping point occurred, the media will have a field day. Now you're a minority.
Right.
We're not a majority Christian culture. Therefore, you shouldn't have all these rights that we give you and so on. And it will feed into the culture wars,
Right.
as it does everywhere else in the world. Why that's happening is hard to tell, but I think there are a few things going on. One is as the reputation of the church takes a partly deserved hit,
Mm-hmm.
those who were just nominally saying that they were Christian, maybe went to church because it was socially respectable, said they were Christian because it was socially respectable, they're dropping off because there's not great social respectability anymore saying you're a Christian. There was 15 years ago in America.
Mm-hmm.
You needed to sort of say you were a Christian to be elected to office, pretty much. But all that sort of nominal Christianity is dropping off really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are people who have been genuinely hurt by the church and were part of the church and they've just stopped going.
Right.
And they've stopped calling themselves Christians because they're harmed.
They're just not there. They're hurt. Yeah.
And it seems to me, I mean, I'm an outsider, so take or leave me. I definitely could be wrong on this. But it seems to me that the believing church has some options now in this really interesting situation. One is to turn up the volume and get angry.
Right.
And I think you see that.
Right.
And you see it in a sort of political level, but you see it religiously as well. And sometimes they're together.
Connected. Yeah, connected.
Well, the other is to take a deep breath. Remember that Christ is still Lord, regardless of how well things are going for the church. And just seek gently to love and persuade the world. Not to think, I own America, so America should, come and be Christian.
Right.
But to say, I love America, like America's, a friend who's not a Christian.
Yeah.
America isn't a backsliding Christian. Think of America as not yet a Christian.
Yeah.
And I think the church will be sweeter and gentler, as it should be, if it follows Christ.
Yeah.
So it seems to me there is this point, and I see both. I meet, sadly, and sometimes see on the media, the angry, loud, let's get back to Christian roots, etc. And others who are just as keen to get back to Christian roots.
Right. They just do it differently.
But their approach is gentle and respectful, and their method is persuasion. And that's the old method.
Yeah.
That's how Christians did
That's
it
how
in
it
the
started,
ancient
right?
world. Because they didn't have power. They didn't have armies. They had no legislation, very little wealth. But they had prayer. Yeah. They had a serving attitude.
Yeah.
They were willing to suffer. Yeah. And they persuaded. And they had some very good persuaders in those first 3 centuries. So I think those things, prayer, service, suffering, and persuasion, they're the old tools. Yeah. And when Christians, whether it's in Australia or America, just go back to those tools, that's enough. You can change the world with those tools.
Yeah.
But whatever you try and add to those tools or even replace those tools with
Anger,
the other stuff,
or whatever,
I think it's going to backfire.
Yeah.
Because I'm constantly reminded, how can you possibly commend the Lord who gave himself for you with an angry, arrogant tone?
Yeah.
Like, it's just, talk about a clash,
like my drumming. There you go. Fascinating. So maybe in the time that we have, as we kind of bring this together, how do we turn? We talked earlier about when you believe something, you turn it into action, and maybe help us think through wherever the belief systems are. How do you turn it into action that's positive, that's persuasive, that's helpful, that expresses love, respect, and humility? Because for all of us who say, yeah, I could be wrong. Now, as a parent, I didn't say that much, but I'm learning as my kids get older, I could be wrong on this thing or that thing. I believe what I believe, but if you go in there, you can, I find you can learn a lot. People will talk to you, and it doesn't take away from what you believe. How do we think about that? How do you see that? And then how do you see today's culture, the strength of it? You talk. This is an Aussie term for cotton candy, right? What is it?
Fairy floss.
Fairy floss. Yeah. So we'll stay with cotton candy there. Yeah. Where it looks really big and colorful, but it's empty inside. And how do we help people fill up?
Wow. The first thing has to be just the recognition that so many things are cotton candy.
Yeah.
And I suspect there is a wide sense, a growing sense of that. Things come and go so quickly. It's like we're just looking for the next thing.
Yeah.
But actually the next thing doesn't satisfy. Yeah. It is like cotton candy.
Yeah.
Tasty and then gone. And it will not nourish you. The nourishing things, I'm of the view that the nourishing things are the old things and the most basic things. So the nourishing things are good relationships.
Yeah.
Like even before we bring God into it.
Yeah.
And all the studies show that there are a few things that make people content. So I think content is a better word than happiness, but often the word is content. Often the word is happiness, but content, that is at peace, a level of joy in the world. And the positive psychology movement is adamant that there are just a few things that give that grounding. And it isn't an iPhone or the next Unreal app. Even though I'm app crazy, I'm device crazy, all that. It's relationships, good functioning relationships. They're almost a guarantee of a kind of settled, content personality. And the other thing they say, and this is apparently the jackpot, this is coming out of all the research from Martin Seligman, who's a leader in positive psychology, Dan Gilbert at Harvard. They say a sense of higher meaning, that you can find a reason why you're here. And these people aren't Christians at all, but they do admit that there's a reason religious people tend to score much higher on the content surveys than the general population. It's because they are generally thrust into relationships that are sometimes awkward, but actually they bumble their way through and find out that you can actually be friends with people who are very different from you.
Absolutely.
And you can receive care from, and you can care for people very different from you. And that happens in church, in the best churches. So they've got relationships, but they also know they're part of something much bigger. And when a human knows you're part of something bigger, your life counts because of that bigger narrative, you've hit the jackpot.
Yeah.
That's what the research says. And I think it's really, we could have got that from the Bible. It's great that Dan Gilbert from Harvard has written a book about it, but it's there in the oldest book.
Yeah.
And that oldest book, and especially those Gospels, those biographies of Jesus, I personally think if people return to that, you've found the ultimate, I don't know what the opposite of cotton candy is, but a good piece of steak.
That's right.
That's nourishing. And if you're a vegetarian, maybe a beautiful eggplant. I don't know. But it's nourishing and it's sustaining. It's not here today, gone tomorrow.
Yeah.
So for me, it's back to the Gospels. And if someone's listening who hasn't read those biographies of Jesus for quite a while or only remembers them as a kid, go back to them because it's actually adult literature.
Yeah.
And you'll find there relationship and you'll find meaning.
Yeah, fabulous. And that connects us back to our culture, and like we started with, that's the good news.
Yeah.
There's a solution, because a lot of us are, are hurting. We talk a lot about, the diseases across our country. Now I'm not talking about COVID. I'm talking about depression. I'm talking about isolation. I'm talking about addiction. Those sorts of pieces too are just devastating. And when we have a friend who's in a place like that, it's just absolutely heartbreaking. And finding a way to connect back to purpose and meaning, and building relationships, like you said. Maybe as we close, I'll give you the last word. If there's he's got a good story to to help us close with, something that kind of expresses an experience that you may have had that kind of sums it all up from what you believe and why it's so important to you. If you just something maybe to share as we kind of wrap up our time together here. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Well,
but,
I almost feel like I could go back to that volunteer teacher where we started.
Please do.
Because there was something that I can sum up what it was about her that was really compelling, that still stays with me as sort of the double principle that holds my life together. And the best way to illustrate it is when I was 16 and I was interested in Christianity but still a tearaway with all my mates, I remember a party where we were blind drunk. Like terrible. I won't give the gory details. But we suddenly realised we can't go home because our parents will kill us. Especially this one mate, because he had a dad who was very strict, Daniel. And we were going, oh no, because you're not coming to my house, you're not staying at my house. What do we do with Daniel? And we then suddenly remembered, hang on, doesn't that volunteer teacher live 500 metres up the road? It's midnight. We go up to her house. I mean, slightly very intoxicated. but we thought, that Christian teacher, she'll look after us.
She'll take us in.
Now, she was a teetotaler, never touched a drop of alcohol. She was always on at us for drinking. But we go to her house at midnight. We knock on her door. We interrupt a very posh dinner party. Like she was into big posh dinner parties. We knock. She looks at us. She can see the situation. She didn't bat an eyelid. She led us through to the back of the house. She went and got some pajamas from her son. Said, "Look, wash Daniel up. Stick him in the shower. Stick him in the jammies. Put him in the back wing of the house, and we'll look after him. Come and get him in the morning." And sure enough, we washed him and put him in jammies, and he slept there that night. And we turned up the next morning, and there was Daniel at the kitchen table, and this woman, Glenda Weldon, cooking him bacon and eggs, and he looked worse for the wear. But as I reflect on that, this woman conveyed to me the generosity of spirit that is at the heart of Christ himself and is meant to be at the heart of the church, but so often isn't, without losing her convictions. So this is the weird thing. We knew she was dead against alcohol. And here we were drunk, and she just didn't blink.
She didn't judge.
Didn't judge us. She saw the situation. She just cared for us. She was able to do two things at one time that just stay with me. She could flex the muscle of conviction. We knew what she believed, and she believed it strong. But also the muscle of compassion. Never one without the other. And so often in the church, but in just politics, we just got one or the other. We know the person who's all conviction, no compassion. It's ugly. And then there's the person of all compassion and no conviction, and it's weak. But Jesus was the master at doing both. But I first saw that in this volunteer teacher. And if I'm trying to be and do anything in this world, I'm trying to be a person of deep conviction who will never lack compassion.
Wonderful. John Dickson, thank you so much. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your stories. Thanks for your insight. And thanks for the reminder as we go through this of the virtue of humility. And maybe every once in a while when things get heated, just stop and go, maybe I could be wrong. This is what I believe, but how do I convey it in a way that engages somebody in a relationship, in a conversation, and rather than just tries to win, and balances that strength of our belief system, that conviction, with the compassion of caring for other people.
Yeah.
John, thanks so much. Appreciate the time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right.
Appreciate it.